Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining in for today's teaching session. Part of our seminar series which we have been doing all every 2-3 weeks. Today we're going to be talking on a very important subject, which is how to evaluate a splenomegaly. And we have got Vinay, Dr. Vinay MV, who has kindly agreed to be speaking on this topic. So I think he's going to make this topic practical and simple, how to evaluate a patient. A few words about Dr. Vinay. Vinay is basically alumni from the Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education, Chandigarh, PGI Chandigarh. He has done his DM Pediatric Hematology Oncology from there. Then he has been also trained in Bristol for a short while in bone marrow transplant. He was a faculty at St. John's Medical College in Bangalore previously, and now he's joined very recently. Joined Rainbow Hospitals in Bangalore. So thank you, Vinay, for agreeing to talk to us today. And I'm hoping the session to be very interactive and insightful and give us some practical tips on how to evaluate these patients. On a different note, I think Ria has sent a question, as a survey for all of you, as there was a request for change of timing. So that survey has been sent to all of you. Please fill in that survey so that we can make some decisions on the time change. And also, it also takes the opportunity to invite all of you for the virtual CME, which is going to be the next weekend on Saturday and Sunday. Dr. Vasu and his team from KMC Mangalore has put a lot of effort and a lot of hard work in bringing that CME all together. So it's going to be on Saturday afternoon and Sunday afternoon, and also stay back on Saturday afternoon, those who are the PHO members, for the general body meeting. So over to you, Vinay, for the session for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It's my pleasure to be presenting on this platform. At the outset, I would like to thank the PHO team, Sunil Bhatt sir, Neeta ma'am, and Mamta Manglani ma'am for giving me this opportunity. So I'll now start sharing my slides. Ria, is it there? Are the slides there? Okay. Okay. So today the topic for discussion would be hypersplenism, and I thought it would be good if we do a case-based approach to make it more interesting. Let me start off with a case. So Master AM, he's an 8-year-old boy. He's born to a 3rd-degree consanguineous marriage, and he presents with history of distension of abdomen, edema of the feet, jaundice, and melena for about 1 month or so. And there is a significant history of sibling in the family, with sibling death with liver failure at the age of 7 years. On examination, findings of jaundice, pallor, and edema are confirmed, and liver is 2 centimeters below costal margin, and it has a sharp border, and spleen is 6 centimeters below costal margin. So history and examination says that child is having some form of liver cell failure along with hepatosplenomegaly. And so further evaluation showed the complete blood picture showed pancytopenia, hemoglobin of 6.2, white cell count of 2,500, and platelets of 75,000. The liver function test showed bilirubin of 7 with increased direct component, albumin 2.5, INR of 1.7. So there is a pancytopenia with deranged liver functions. And going on further with the evaluation, an ultrasound abdomen done suggested there were features suggestive of liver cirrhosis and splenomegaly, with spleen being about 18 centimeters in the long axis. An ultrasound Doppler showed portal vein distension along with collaterals, which was suggestive of portal hypertension. And also upper GI endoscopy showed esophageal varices. So it's one of the common clinical presentations of a child presenting with liver failure in the first decade and family history being positive. So we would be thinking about something like inherited cause for liver failure. So most common cause being Wilson's disease. So child was worked up for Wilson's disease, and he had a serum ceruloplasmin of 4, which was low, and the slit lamp examination also had KF ring. So this was a case of Wilson's disease with portal hypertension. And Because he has pancytopenia as well, and also there is underlying liver pathology, so it is secondary hypersplenism. So this child was started on conservative measures, including salt-restricted diet, diuretics, and some supportive measures. For Wilson's disease, he was started on penicillamine and zinc. Because the cytopenias were moderate, he was just managed conservatively. He was in the hospital for about 2 weeks and then discharged. So let us start with some basics. Spleen is the largest lymphoid organ in the body, and it is placed intra-abdominally and in the left hypochondrium and the epigastrium. Anatomical things that are important are it is a very soft in structure and highly vascular. So that is why this is the organ that can swell to the maximum. So it can increase up to 15 to 20 times its size. It's because it's highly vascular and there's a lot of space for expansion inside the abdominal cavity. So it's one of the unique things that this organ, it can, like the splenomegaly can be massive. The splenic blood flow is about 5 to 10% of the total cardiac output, and it comes to about 250 to 300 ml per minute. So these two are peculiarities that the spleen possesses. That is, it can swell up to a big size, and also it is supplied. It has a very big vascular supply. Two words on functions of spleen. We all know that spleen is constituted of red pulp and white pulp. So the red pulp, the functions that red pulp does, red pulp is nothing but the fenestrated sinusoids that drain blood from the arterioles and to the veins. And when the cells pass through the through the sinusoids, two important functions happen in the spleen, that is called culling and pitting. So culling is nothing but destruction of the old red cells, and pitting means removal of the cytoplasmic inclusions like inside the red cells. White pulp, on the other hand, is the carries out the immunological function. Basically, it recognizes the antigen, opsonizes, and also with the help of tissue macrophages does phagocytosis. The other important function of the spleen, rather than function, this is the one that actually causes results in the hypersplenism, is the reservoir function of spleen. So whenever spleen starts over functioning, it can also store a lot of blood inside it, and that is and close to, like in the normal circulation, about 25% of platelets are stored in the spleen, and when there is increased activity of spleen, the about 75 to 80% of platelets can get sequestered in the spleen, and it can also sequester granulocytes to a large extent. So how do we define hypersplenism? So there is no diagnostic criteria as such to define hypersplenism, but it is basically characterized by features which include mono or multi-lineage cytopenia of variable degree, and splenomegaly, usually of a long-standing history. So if we do a bone marrow in such cases, it is usually normocellular or hypercellular. So doing bone marrow is not an essential diagnostic test to label as hypersplenism, but when it is done as a part of workup for the etiology, it is seen that it is either normal or hypercellular. Often the bone marrow compensates for the peripheral cytopenia. And hypersplenism is not a primary diagnosis. It is a secondary, most often it is a secondary cause for some other primary etiology. So hypersplenism is a clinical syndrome and not a diagnosis by itself. It happens due to increased activity of splenic function. And most importantly, there will be splenic pooling and sequestration of blood cells to variable degree, which can cause cytopenia. So clinically, cytopenia can be of variable degree. Usually it is moderate, but in few conditions, it can be significant enough to result in transfusion dependency. And sometimes at the extreme of spectrum, it can be life-threatening also sometimes. Spleen size is not a reliable indicator of its function. So hypersplenism doesn't go hand in hand with massive splenomegaly or size of the spleen. Patients with massive splenomegaly might not have any form of cytopenia secondary to spleen sequestration. On the other hand, a small spleen, which might be just palpable, also can be hyperactive and can cause cytopenia. So coming back to case 1, so this child actually had liver cirrhosis with portal hypertension, dilated portal vein, increased blood supply to the spleen, which caused splenomegaly, and cytopenias were because of hypersplenism. So Wilson's disease, portal hypertension, and secondary hypersplenism. So because hypersplenism was just moderate degree of cytopenia, it was managed conservatively. So this child comes back to outpatient department 6 weeks later, and he's seen that he's clinically improved. His liver functions have improved. The spleen still stays the same at 6 centimeters, and he still has persistent pancytopenia. Hemoglobin of 7.6, white cell count of 1900 with ANC of 1140, and platelets of 62,000. Reticulocyte count done is 0.4%. So at this point, the pediatric colleagues or pediatric gastroenterology colleagues feel a bit worried about the ANC of 1100, and they refer to the hematology side for further opinion and management. So if we see this case further, there has been improvement in liver cell failure once the child has been started on treatment for Wilson's disease with supportive measures. And cytopenias, apart from the granulocyte, like apart from the neutrophil count that has dropped further, other cytopenias are not very significant. And this child has been started on penicillamine recently and 6 weeks ago, and it is a good timeline for this drug to cause some amount of myelosuppression. Sometimes, rarely, it can cause agranulocytosis as well. So in this child, it's good to withhold penicillamine and for about 2 weeks and get a gastroenterology opinion if that drug can be substituted or should be started at a lower dose. The point I wanted to make out of this is, even if the child is labeled with hypersplenism, think of additional factors that can exacerbate cytopenia. If the initial cytopenias were moderate and you label the child as hypersplenism, and there are other contributing factors, then it is good to correct those things rather than to act just on hypersplenism causing cytopenia and be worried about it. Let's go to the next case. This is a 4-year-old boy who presents with mild anemia and jaundice, and he's been evaluated at 4 years and diagnosed as non-transfusion dependent thalassemia, beta thalassemia. And he's been on supplements including folic acid, vitamin D, calcium, and on regular follow-up, 3-monthly follow-up. At the age of 10 years, the pediatrician seeing him notices that he's developed increasing anemia and his hemoglobin has stayed somewhere between 6 and 7 in the last year. He has leukopenia with white cell count and ANCs on the lower side, thrombocytopenia which is moderate, and spleen size has increased from about 4-5 centimeters a year ago, 1.5 years ago, to 8 centimeters now. And he also has a growth stunting with height between 3rd and 15th centile. So what are the causes of exaggerated anemia in the child with non-transfusion dependency? So sometimes intercurrent infections can cause that. If the child is minimally transfused, then alloimmunization might be a cause, but it should cause only single lineage cytopenia. And micronutrient deficiency, if not addressed, that might also cause something like pancytopenia because there is ineffective erythropoiesis and increased marrow function. However, when those are ruled out and the picture is clear that there is increasing spleen and there is pancytopenia, then it can be because of hypersplenism in this child. So the physician on this occasion advised splenectomy at 10 years of age with these being the basis. Hypersplenism, like if the spleen is taken out, the hypersplenism is taken care and cytopenias would recover. And he has a growth failure, and probably that might be contributed by the anemia. And if you decrease the rate of hemolysis occurring in the spleen, then you could help. So the same child, when followed till age of 17, he develops swelling of the left upper limb, and the Doppler shows axillary vein thrombosis. So what are the indications of splenectomy in thalassemia? What do the guidelines say? So the Thalassemia International Federation guidelines state the indications of splenectomy as worsening anemia leading to poor growth, hypersplenism causing clinically significant cytopenia, and massive splenomegaly, which results in dragging pain, early satiety, and size more than 20 centimeters, which puts the child under risk for spontaneous rupture. Although these are the indications, I must say that these are relative indications for splenectomy. And now in the present era, splenectomy is not a sorted management option in thalassemic patients. It's always good to see if we can bridge the time, like in a child who is in the growing phase, in the pubertal age, might require more transfusion requirement might be there. So we need to see if the child can be bridged with some transfusion support, which actually ameliorates most of these problems. So if the patient is, if he has access for good transfusion transfusion facilities and also good access to chelation, then probably we could improve all the three things that the splenectomy can help as well. Like the growth might be helped, and even the cytopenia, the spleen gets regressed if you suppress the extramedullary erythropoiesis, and also the spleen size comes down. So if we see what was the incidence of splenectomy before and now, in 1960, the incidence was close to 57%. And in the last 5 decades, and especially in 21st century, it is, I think it's less than 5%. So it says about 5 to 7% kids still undergo the splenectomy in the first, even in the non-transfusion dependent time in class. What are the risks of splenectomy in thalassemia? There is an increased risk of thrombosis, as we saw in this child. Post-splenectomy, splenectomy itself is an independent risk factor for thrombosis. It increases, the relative risk is about 6.5 times more than non-splenectomized patients. And it increases the risk of pulmonary hypertension. Splenectomy is an independent risk factor for pulmonary hypertension, which is the most common morbidity in adulthood for non-transfusion dependent thalassemics. And also, as we all know, the opportunistic infections are higher with splenectomy, and the mortality rate can go as high as 50% if there is opportunistic infections and sepsis in splenectomized patients. Okay, coming to case 3, this is a 4-year-old boy born to non-consanguineous parents, and he has progressive abdominal distension for a year, normal development, normal, no dysmorphism. He has some bruising over abdominal wall and the lower limbs. He has massive hepatosplenomegaly, as we can see in the clinical photograph where the surface anatomy has been marked, and normal neurological examination. The CBC done shows pancytopenia again here. Platelets are 64,000, supported, otherwise around 20,000. He has normal liver function and renal functions, and then ultrasound abdomen was done, which shows normal ecotexture of the liver, and portal architecture was normal as well. So further going into the evaluation, he underwent a bone marrow which showed normal cellularity but increased histiocytes and large lipid-laden macrophages. So this is another cause of massive splenomegaly and hypersplenism due to bone marrow as well as splenic infiltration, and this is a storage disease. So commonest storage disease being Gaucher. The enzyme levels were done, which was low. So the diagnosis was storage disease Gaucher. A word about storage disorders. So there is abnormal substrates get deposited in various tissues, most importantly liver, spleen, bone marrow, and the lung. And that is what happens in most of the storage disorders which have big hepatosplenomegaly. And many times the splenomegaly also results in hypersplenism. Hypersplenism associated with storage disorder. So cytopenia is contributed not just by hypersplenism, but also due to bone marrow infiltration in such cases. So it is always important to treat the underlying cause rather than to do a splenectomy or anything to avoid hypersplenism. So avoid splenectomy as much as possible unless clinically significant severe cytopenia happen with transfusion dependency. So this child actually became transfusion dependent with severe systemic bleeds, and splenectomy was done as a rescue measure in this child. This gave him some time, so he survived some time, so that the enzyme replacement therapy was sanctioned on compassionate basis, and he could get the replacement therapy. So sometimes hypersplenism might be so severe that it can be life-threatening and might have to be acted on. But the principle is, when it is caused from it is a secondary cause because of a primary etiology, it is always good to treat it. The primary etiology should be addressed first. The next case, I would like to share this interesting and a bit complicated case that I was involved when I was in UK in Bristol. So this is a girl, 7-year-old girl, who was a Syrian refugee who was actually relocated in UK. And she unfortunately was diagnosed with T-cell ALL in April 2018. And she was on UCAL protocol 2011 on the trial. So she was well in maintenance therapy, and about 22 months from the diagnosis, in February 2020, she developed progressive cytopenia, splenomegaly. So she, one-off visit when she came for follow-up on the maintenance, she had cytopenia and just palpable spleen. And like in maintenance, if the counts are low, we interrupt the chemo. She got vincristine and steroid pulse, and she went and was called back after a couple of weeks. So when she came back in 2 weeks, the spleen size had increased to 4 centimeters, and there was worsening cytopenia, and she also developed fever. So in a background disease like this, cytopenia and splenomegaly cannot be taken lightly, and she was evaluated extensively. So complete blood picture showed pancytopenia of moderate cytopenia. Peripheral smear had no abnormal cells. Platelets were decreased. She did not have any. She did not have any TPMT mutations, and which was evaluated upfront in the start of the therapy. And she had normal B12 and folate levels. Infections including viral, fungal, bacterial, atypical, and parasitic infection. A battery of tests were done and to rule out. And because relapse was high on card, some marrow was done, which showed normal cellularity, and the flow and molecular MRD were negative, and there was no evidence of hemophagocytosis. Ferritin was 870. Although because she was fitting into the clinical picture of HLH with bicytopenia, with pancytopenia, splenomegaly, and fever, she was given pulse steroids, but there was no response. Further going to the event, she also got a PET CT done, which showed heterogeneous uptake, like very small focal uptake in the liver, diffuse uptake in the spleen, and only 2 vertebral bones had a very minute uptake. So this case, because it was a bit complex to know, complicated to know the etiology, it was discussed in the National Hematology multidisciplinary team meeting, and the opinion from the committee was to go ahead and do a diagnostic splenectomy, because spleen had the maximum uptake. There was no other source to get the diagnosis from. So a diagnostic splenectomy was done, and to a surprise for all of us, the spleen showed histology showed histiocytic sarcoma. So later when it was discussed, it was told that there were 2 or 3 cases in the entire country which had presented as this was like a transdifferentiation relapse on a child who was on treatment for leukemia. So following splenectomy in this child, there was transient improvement in cytopenia. So because it was a disseminated disease, we knew from the PET CT, and the disease is very aggressive, she was planned for intensive chemotherapy regimen, which including etoposide, cyclophosphamide, and there was only marginal improvement, almost nothing. And then a repeat marrow that was done in the meantime also showed dissemination into the marrow as well. So later she actually received targeted therapy, trametinib, which is a MEK inhibitor, and the disease was controlled and quickly taken up for transplant with a sibling donor, and she underwent transplant. So the thing I wanted to, why I brought this case here is, whenever we have a background disease or a background complex scenario, it's always good to do a comprehensive workup to find the etiology. And here, although it might be there might be some contribution from the spleen causing cytopenia, but it was basically the progressive or refractory malignancy that was actually, it was more like consumption of all the blood like components. And whenever we do a splenectomy for whatever therapeutic purpose or whatever, it is always good to do a histopathological examination. Few other cases that can present, like splenomegaly with cytopenia and etiology not known, undergo splenectomy, or some cases like splenic hemangioma or angiosarcoma, things like that, which might be picked up on imaging, but it's always good to do a histopathological examination if you get the spleen out. Um, uh, Infections are also known to cause splenomegaly and hypersplenism. So tropical splenomegaly syndrome is one of the common differentials that we think. However, it's not so common in children, and usually occurs in might happen in older children living in malarial endemic areas because of recurrent infections with malaria. And it is characterized by moderate cytopenia, massive splenomegaly, and usually the malarial antibody test will be positive with increased IgM, but they would not have any constitutional symptoms like fever or no peripheral blood parasitemia. So the treatment here would be antimalarials and conservative measures to follow. Other hepatotropic viruses that can cause chronic liver disease can also result in hypersplenism secondary to portal hypertension. Few other infections endemic to few places like Kala Azar, which can be indolent for some time, cause massive splenomegaly, and cytopenia is one of the things. Schistosomiasis can cause portal vein obstruction and hypersplenism. Chronic EBV infections is also known to cause hypersplenism, but all of them are anecdotal reports. Few other case reports that I saw which were atypical were hypersplenism due to fungal infection in a child treated for Hodgkin's lymphoma. And here again, splenectomy was the option taken up for treatment. And then later on, it was found to be a fungal infection. And tuberculosis of the spleen is a well-known entity. And sometimes treatment of like splenomegaly, isolated splenomegaly with constitutional symptoms, and it's always good to also evaluate for tuberculosis in such children. Another big group of disorders that can cause hypersplenism include non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis. So it's an umbrella term used for pre-sinusoidal portal hypertension of different varied etiology. It is described as with different names like idiopathic portal hypertension and previously called as Bunty syndrome, which is now an obsolete term. Onset usually is in second and third decade, but there is a case series published from ILBS Delhi telling that it's not an uncommon condition in second decade as well. Like in the between 10 to 15 years, many children present with non-EHPVO and NCPF kind of condition that can present with hypersplenism. And liver functions usually are preserved with there is no evidence of cirrhosis on biopsy. Hypersplenism is reported to an extent of 60 to 90% of cases, and splenomegaly is there universally in 100% of cases. So what is the etiology for NCPF? It can be chronic or recurrent bacterial infection. The hypothesis is that there is gut translocation bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, which can go and cause fibrosis around the portal vein. Chronic arsenic exposure is also known to cause, but however, this is a common factor that has been indicated in adult population. And chemotherapy, I think subset of patients that we treat who are on chemotherapy might have features suggestive of portal hypertension and spleen being palpable, sometimes having mild cytopenia. And chemotherapeutic agents like methotrexate, thiopurines, and azathioprine, when used as immunosuppression, is known to cause this entity. The prognosis is good because there is no liver pathology, and if the portal hypertension is controlled, then it's just conservative management of the cytopenia. And for portal hypertension, shunt surgeries could be done. A review published from COG group about hepatobiliary late effects in survivors of children. So what they state is hepatobiliary complication is not an uncommon condition in children treated for malignancy, but is often underreported. Chronic hepatitis, fatty infiltration of the liver, and variable degree of fibrosis often happen in children treated on chemotherapy. The risk factors or the inciting agents include chemotherapeutic agents like thiopurines, methotrexate, and sometimes actinomycin. Not just the VOD component, but it can also cause some amount of fibrosis. Then radiation exposure more than 40 gray is known to cause liver damage. Chronic GVHD post-transplant often involves, if it involves liver, can cause cholestatic issues and can also result in portal hypertension over a period of time. Transfusion-associated hemosiderosis is also one of the risk factors, and restricted transfusion regimen would benefit such patients to prevent liver damage. And increased risk of viral hepatitis in these children can also be a risk factor. There is no consensus as of now to monitor how to monitor these long-term survivors on with regards to the liver function. However, if there is more than one risk factor that is there, then it is always good to document in the long-term follow-up clinic. Other rare causes that can cause hypersplenism include Feltis syndrome. This again is not a common problem in pediatric population. However, anecdotal reports suggest that there are patients with JRA who have presented with big spleen and cytopenia. So it is a triad of arthritis, splenomegaly, and cytopenia, most commonly granulocytopenia. It is immune-mediated hyperplasia of the spleen that causes, and treatment is the management is to treat the underlying condition with immunosuppressive agents. And another condition, myelofibrosis, although primary myelofibrosis is not a common thing, secondary myelofibrosis can happen in children, and it is often confused with hypersplenism because they present with massive splenomegaly and variable degree of cytopenia. So here, although it is not hypersplenism, it is good. It is a differential diagnosis, and doing a bone marrow would give us the diagnosis in such cases, and treating the primary etiology would help resolve the splenomegaly as well as cytopenias improve. A small word about sickle sequestration in spleen. So this it is not hypersplenism as such because of the rapidity with which it develops. However, the physiology or the pathology is the same. There is a sudden accumulation or sequestration of large volumes of blood inside the spleen, and it is heralded by the triad of rapid increase in spleen size, hemoglobin dropping more than 2 gram per deciliter, and child being unstable with cardiovascular collapse. And it happens because of vicious cycle of sickle cells being trapped in the spleen, and they in the sinusoids, and they get deoxygenated further, resulting in more sickling, and then there is increased congestion and rapid drop in hemoglobin. So it is one of the serious vaso-occlusive crisis, commonly occurs in a very young age, and most of the times, more than 50% of the times, there is recurrence of sequestration. And the management, the immediate management, it has to be managed like a medical emergency, and stabilizing the patient with red cell transfusion being guarded, not to increase the viscosity of the blood. Important is about the long-term management. So most of the cases, many cases don't require specific management for splenic sequestration, especially if the episode is not very severe and the recurrences are not common, because as the child ages, probably there is autosplenectomy and the sequestration episodes decreases. But if it is a very severe episode and life-threatening one, then there are two options: to either to put them on regular transfusion so that the deoxygenated sickle cells do not get clustered in the spleen, or to go ahead and get a splenectomy done. So splenectomy is also one of the treatment options in such scenario, wherein you take out the problem, the place where the problem is happening, and that would help. Any role of spleen, like the role of spleen and the transplant world. So I tried looking into literature, and there is one registry publication from CIBMTR registry to looking at effects of spleen status on early outcomes at after hematopoietic transplant. So they looked at about 9,600 odd transplants over a period of 16 years from the registry, and they observed that they tried comparing 3 cohort, wherein one of the cohort was patients who went into transplant after having a prior splenectomy, which was about 470 patients. The biggest cohort was with normal spleen, and the other cohort with splenomegaly, who went into transplant with splenomegaly. So what they could conclude was the engraftment, the neutrophil and platelet engraftment was slightly earlier in the splenectomized group. However, there was no difference in day plus 100 count recovery or chimerism, and no difference in overall survival or the GVHD rates. So among the splenomegaly group, the use of peripheral stem cells with higher cell dose improved the engraftment. So there is always this fear when we take children into transplant with big spleen, whether the child will engraft, whether there is a primary rejection that can happen, and things like that. Basically, because there is a fear that the stem cells can get sequestered in the spleen and delaying the engraftment. Also, being a lymphoid and immune mediating organ, it can sometimes cause graft versus host disease. So one of the other malignant transplants where splenectomy is often discussed is in JMML. So JMML is one of the condition where patients are directly taken to transplant without much of pre-transplant chemotherapy to decrease the burden of the disease. So the EBMT data published in 2005, they compared seeing patients who had spleen size less than 5 centimeters in comparison to children who had spleen more than 5 centimeters, and looked at the data. So there was no statistical difference in the outcome. However, children who went ahead with spleen less than 5 centimeter had a slightly improved survival. And later on, the Eurocord data in 2013 showed a little more significant difference, little more significant but not meeting statistical significant difference with cord transplants in JMML, where the 5-year disease-free survival post-splenectomy was 56% compared to 36%. However, it is still a question that needs to be answered, and the hypothesis here is that cord transplants, usually the cell dose is low, and that might be delaying engraftment and probably increasing the rejection. However, there is no consensus whether supporting either splenectomy or not going with splenectomy pre-transplant. Another condition where when I searched, I got was splenomegaly and thalassemia. So this is one of the publications from our country, from Sankalp Foundation. So this is an abstract presented in ASH in 2017, where they looked at matched sibling transplants in low-risk thalassemia in 87 patients, and they compared children who had spleen more than 3 centimeters with the other and the other cohort. So there were about 11 children with splenomegaly of spleen size more than 3 centimeters, and 4 out of 11 showed rejection. And there was some statistic, like it was splenomegaly and rejection had some correlation was there. However, there was no relation with the transplant related mortality. The same group again tried to change the conditioning regimen in patients who had splenomegaly and look at it. So a total of 187 patients were analyzed in retrospective analysis, and 2 regimen were used. The first one was BuSci ATG, and in the second, beyond after 2017, they tried using BuSci ATG at a higher dose with fludarabine for more immunosuppression. And they found that the rejection rates were lower in if more additional immunosuppression were given in these patients, and there was a higher difference, more statistically significant in the splenomegaly group. So this is the protocol that they use. So BuSci ATG was the regimen A, the initial one, followed by increased immunosuppression with ATG and fludarabine, whether it improved the outcome. So the rejection rates came down after that, and it was statistically significant. So coming back to hypersplenism, so how do we classify hypersplenism? So it is classified as primary hypersplenism when there is no cause that is known. So this constitutes to less than 10% of the cases, and always there should be an effort to find the cause. And the secondary hypersplenism is the main cohort of patients that have this problem, and various etiologies like infection, hematological causes, storage disorders, malignancy, myeloproliferative problems, and immune hyperplasia are the causes. And there is one other class called occult hypersplenism, wherein there are no apparent cytopenia, but because the marrow would be functioning, the marrow would be compensating for the cytopenia. So such patients actually present with transient cytopenia when they have interrecurrent infections and things like that, and nothing needs to be done. So I try to just make a framework for diagnostic approach. So first of all, when there is a case that comes as hypersplenism, ascertain whether it is hypersplenism. So cytopenia, long-standing splenomegaly, no other cause for cytopenia to be ruled out. So always try to look for the etiology. Most common cause for etiology would be a liver disease or portal hypertension. So do the evaluation required for it, and if it is that, then treat the primary cause. If the patient presents with systemic or constitutional symptoms, always look for features like infection, infiltration, and immune mediated problems for splenomegaly. And infiltrative disorders include non-malignant and malignant disorders. Non-malignant group predominantly includes the storage diseases. And the other one is if there are blood smear abnormalities right up front, then always it would be a hematological cause causing splenomegaly, and it needs further evaluation. So treating the primary etiology is the most important thing, and that's how the diagnostic approach should be. So management wise, try to ascertain hypersplenism first. Try to look for primary etiology. Check for any additional factors that are contributing for cytopenia, like bone marrow suppression or autoimmune cytopenia. And try to treat the primary etiology. So if it is an infection, treat the infection. If it is a liver disease, do medical management, or if it is an indication for transplant, go ahead. Portal hypertension, things like shunt surgery can decrease hypersplenism to some extent. Storage disorders would need medical treatment. If there is extramedullary hematopoiesis, always good to suppress the erythropoiesis by treating the primary etiology. And assess the severity of hypersplenism. Most often it is asymptomatic with moderate cytopenia, in which case nothing needs to be done, just conservative management treating the primary cause. If it is symptomatic, then check if it can be managed with supportive measures, and try to avoid splenectomy as much as possible. In case it is it is symptomatic and very severe, then splenectomy, the options would be splenectomy with vaccination. Partial splenectomy has been reported in some literature, which might be beneficial to preserve the splenic function as well as to overcome hypersplenism. Partial splenic arterial embolization is another strategy that can be used. However, we should have experience and expertise in the treating facility if those options are sorted. So the take-home messages would be, hypersplenism is a clinical syndrome, not a primary diagnosis. Investigation into primary cause is the most vital thing. Treat the primary cause and don't be worried about the cytopenia. Moderate cytopenia does not necessitate any treatment. Avoid splenectomy as much as possible. Thank you.
Vinay, that was really excellent and very extensive. I think you really covered the each and every aspect of splenomegaly and hypersplenism. Just a question, we'll wait for others to pitch in also. I think you mentioned a second case of thalassemia. I think it's one of the commonest situations we're coming across, and because of our poor management of thalassemias and pre-transplant hemoglobin is not being maintained, we see a lot of patients with splenomegalys which worsen and progress over a period of time. Now, as you know, it's a continuation. It's a continuum. It's not a it's not a one kind of a one-time phenomena. It's a continuous process of splenomegaly and a slow evolution of hypersplenism in those patients. And we also know that with some hypertransfusion and hydroxyurea, you can probably try to preserve some of these spleens and avoid splenectomies. Now, would you be able to help us in what would be where will you say, okay, no, I don't want to try now, preserving the spleen, enough is enough, and let's now go for splenectomy? Or in other words, when would you still attempt to preserve the spleen with other conservative measures?
Yeah, so basically a child who is poorly managed, like if the child, basically sometimes non-transfusion dependent thalassemia won't remain non-transfusion dependent throughout the entire course. The mutations might be severe, so that they might be going into a transfusion dependent phase, wherein giving transfusion with good chelation is a better approach. However, if there is no access to transfusion facilities or chelation, and if we think that if we put the child on transfusion it won't help, then probably splenectomy is a better choice. But definitely preserving spleen with giving good transfusion would be better in patients who actually few of the very like few children who are very bad with these problems, like mainly delayed puberty, very poor growth, and bony deformities, and also so all these three conditions, when they are there, probably splenectomy alone won't help all of them. It is good to transfuse these children, bring the spleen size down, and at the same time that will help in growth as well as decrease the hypogonadism and things like that, and giving a good chelation at that point of time is good. And most importantly, what we should remember is the long-term morbidity in NTDTs. Most importantly is the pulmonary hypertension and cardiac problems that happen secondary to pulmonary hypertension. So it is very well known that splenectomy increases the risk, and it is always better to avoid, but it has to be taken case by case basis. And if we feel that management with regular transfusion and chelation is not possible, then probably it is better to go for splenectomy. But there are periods in between, like pubertal age group, where we can just bridge with transfusion, attain puberty, and then again they do not require so much of transfusion requirements and can manage with moderate anemia of 7 to 8. So such kids can be just given a bridge of transfusion in between. However, it increases the risk of alloimmunization. That needs to be kept in mind, but it is a case-by-case basis that we need to take.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So I think, I think what I was trying to allude is that we should try to preserve as much as possible if it's, if it's possible. But if it's not possible for various reasons, especially if hypersplenism become what we call as firm spleen and irreversible, then probably we need to consider that. I think there is yeah, so I think Revati ma'am is basically just mentioned a comment in the chat box that if it's younger kids, of course, their chances of hypersensitivity reversal is higher than older kids when, than older kids with hypertransfusion and hydroxyurea. Any other questions anyone has? So what are the vaccinations you are recommending, Vinay? And does that have any impact on the geographical location of the patients where they belong to?
So, pre-splenectomy vaccination, definitely we should immunize them with the pneumococcal vaccines. If they have got a full course of H influenza, need not do that again. And post-splenectomy influenza and typhoid vaccines are recommended. So meningococcal vaccine also, it is better to give. And basically pneumococcal is the most important thing that needs to be covered in children going ahead for splenectomy.
And age-old question of penicillin. Is there duration irrespective of age? So it's again a very big question. Adults do differently, pediatrics do differently. So what's your take?
Yeah. I think there is no clear-cut evidence to favor or not, but there is like the age-old trial, PROPS trial in 1985 or something, suggested that there is the benefit with penicillin prophylaxis, and it is better to give it for a period of 5 years post splenectomy, during which we can observe the child. If the child doesn't have any of the bad infections or things like that, not getting repeatedly admitted, probably it can be stopped with guarded monitoring kind, and we can stop it after 5 years. Few people extend it till 18 years of age, but I think 5 years post splenectomy, if there are no major infections and child is being vaccinated properly, we could stop it.
There's a question here. Start of aspirin. So post splenectomy thrombocytosis, what would be the cutoff for starting aspirin?
Yeah. So basically, post splenectomy is a prothrombotic condition kind. So platelets, as well as like in hemoglobinopathies, it's both the pathophysiology there is both in the red cell membrane as well as in the platelets. So a cutoff of 5 lakh is taken to start aspirin. And whenever the nucleated blood count, especially in thalassaemic patients, if the NRBCs are more than 300 and platelet counts are more than 5 lakh, then there is an increased risk of thrombosis. So it is good to keep the child on aspirin till when the platelet count is more than 5 lakh post splenectomy.
So I think there's one more question. What do you do if the spleen size doesn't regress even after anti-malarial in the case of tropical splenomegaly? So I'm not very sure. You can answer that. So yeah.
So even I'm not sure, it's a difficult scenario, but I think the practical approach would be if the cytopenia is not causing much problem, then just leave it if the patient is able to get along with the big spleen. But in case the patient is very much annoyed with the heaviness of the spleen and problems, then splenectomy can be planned. But cytopenias are usually, if the cytopenia is manageable, then try to avoid splenectomy in such cases.
Yeah, so I don't think there are any other questions. So thank you very much again for your time and extensive reviewing this topic. I think it was very useful. And we have recorded this session. We'll be sharing with others also. The recorded version of this of the topic. So thank you very much again, and thank you for everyone for logging in. Thank you, Neeta and Anand, for coordinating these sessions, and thanks, Ria, for the technical support as usual. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.